I welcome you all to the Bureaucratic Populism, Military, Judiciary, and Institutional Politics workshop. My name is Mohammed Omar, and today we would be talking, engaging, discussing ideas on novel, this very novel idea of bureaucratic populism, and we hope to hopefully develop a empirical and conceptual framework that allows us to understand how institutions such as the military, the judiciary, and the civil services, for example, use populism within their discourses and how they use populism to legitimize their own actions. We would start our workshop by a welcome speech by Professor Simon Tormey. Professor Simon Tormey is a professor of politics and executive dean of arts and education at the Deakin University. Professor Tormey, you have, I invite you now.
Thank you. So we're online as well, Isan, is that right? Even though we can't see them, we know you're out there somewhere in bureaucratic populist land. Welcome everyone to Deakin Downtown. If this is your first visit, it might be. This is our exec hub. We don't do any teaching here, but we do hold important conferences like this. So without any further ado, I should say that we are on Wurundjeri territory here, and we do acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And of course, if there's anyone here of First Nation heritage, a particular warm welcome to you as well. I also want to, because I'm inclined to always forget, to do the thanks bit as well, and the acknowledgement of the extensive support and logistics that underpins an event like this. But most of all, of course, all of you are indebted to Isan for raising a very substantial grant via the Australian Research Council, very important for our work in comparative politics in Deakin University. So well done, Isan and the team. And also to acknowledge as well, are we allowed still to call it the Alfred Deakin Institute, or is it now flipped over into the Institute for Governance and Citizenship and those kind of things? But there are colleagues out there, no doubt, listening, and we do want to acknowledge on behalf of Deakin University your work over, no doubt, weeks and months to put this together. And it's a terrific program. It's the best kind of program, as far as I can see, which is participant-driven. So rather than having a big audience of people, some of whom are messing around on Facebook or whatever, or ordering Christmas presents or whatever, everyone's got skin in the game here and giving a paper. And I'm sure it's going to be an incredibly rich discussion. So, good luck to you for the day. Now, some of you will know, but some of you won't know, that I'm a political theorist by training and have spent more than a few years puzzling over populism myself. And Isan was kind enough to say, Simon, if you could please give us a sort of talk on populism, that would be most welcome. That was about a week and a half ago. So I just thought, from the point of view of prudence here, I wouldn't do a formal presentation because that would either be just dredging stuff up that Isan has heard many times before, or trying to grapple with an intellectual problem at the same time as running a whole load of faculty and university business, and that would probably not result in a very good outcome either. What I can do, however, and happy to do for sort of my 6-7 minutes, if people are happy to have me speak for a little bit, is just give a kind of a reflection from a sort of political theorist point of view on the state of play as far as populism research is concerned. Now, I know populism probably won't be the kind of animating discussion here. Most of the titles and papers suggest that this is really a kind of comparativist conference, which is absolutely as it should be. But what I hopefully can add here is just a few provocations, maybe, of a few think points that might provide some further point for discussion later on, if that's okay. So, and if you wanted to look at my kind of profile on the Deakin page, you can see that really I've been writing about populism or kind of thinking about populism for about 15 years. And many self-contradictory papers there, as some of my critics will point out, that I seem to flip-flop around when I talk about populism, and that's okay in academia, or it's okay for certain kinds of academics. I'm not here defending a sort of Fukuyama thesis or anything like that. I think populism is a bit like that. That would be one of my points, that I think that there's a certain indeterminacy which underpins the concept. In other words, we're not discussing something of a very settled kind or something where there is a very high level of consensus over what populism is. And just upstairs, just before coming down here, I just kind of ran the rule over that kind of indeterminacy. The key names in my part of populism studies, Cass Mudder, very influential for, I think, comparativists as well as political theorists, based on an idea of populism as in some sense ideological. So when I hear the word ideology, that to me triggers the thought that, oh, there must be some sort of shared vision of the world, some sort of shared values which are bundled together and which we can then call populist. A bit like communism, a bit like socialism, a bit like conservatism. The trouble with populism is that it really doesn't operate in that frame at all. Sorry, Cass. I know you're not listening, but I have written fairly extensively on the matter. And we know this can't possibly be the case because we have left-wing populists, we have right-wing populists, we have bureaucratic populists, maybe. That's the topic to come, isn't it? And all kind of manner of other kinds of populists. So the idea that there is an ideological core to populism, I think, stretches the boundaries not merely of imagination, but of sort of conceptual clarity. So I really don't think so. And I think this is going to help you. Bureaucratic populism is not, it seems to me, a kind of an ideological standpoint. It's something about the people, right? And people versus elites. So then you get to the Canavan definitions. We, the people, must be core to a particular kind of discourse. Here I'm kind of with Pierre Rosanvallon. If you haven't sort of looked at Rosanvallon's work on populism, to me it's very, very important as a theorist and historian of the term, where basically Rosanvallon's critique of this approach is to say that in any kind of politics, there is a tension between those who speak for the generality and those who speak for the particularity. There is nothing special about populism from the point of view of political discourse. Every kind of political discourse is trying to claim for itself the title of generality, we the people, as opposed to a narrow or sectional interest within the politics. Now, sometimes that plays out in curious ways, doesn't it? So you get a country like Belgium, where half of it is French-speaking, half of it is Flemish-speaking. Who is the people? It's very obviously contested. I'm from Ireland, very obviously contested. A society of deep cleavage between Protestants and Catholics, nationalists and United Kingdom supporters and all the rest of it. So but everybody still says that they are seeking the best for the people. That is absolutely intrinsic. So the problem with Canavan's approach, I think, is that kind of lack of differentiation, really. Populism is just politics at one level. Then you get to Laclau and you think, well, Tormey must be in favor of Laclau, radical leftist kind of, But Laclau, I think, also suffers from the same thing, which is, well, not suffers from the same thing, but really, I think Laclau is more aware that the claim he's making is that populism is intrinsic to all kinds of political discourse. The problem then becomes, well, how do we differentiate populist discourse from non-populist discourse? So when people say, okay, we're describing some terrain here which isn't populist, what is it? Often people default back to technocracy. And this is another interesting point for your discussion, isn't it? That really are even technocrats non-populists? Are bureaucrats non-populist? It's pretty hard, and I'm sure you guys will really examine this in much closer detail. But it's really, it's just, again, that problem that Rosanvallon raises as far as discourse is concerned is that actually most forms of political discourse, bureaucratic discourse, technocratic discourse have a populist element to them. So again, you're in the kind of problem of differentiation. Now, Laclau goes on and basically says the problem with the left is that it has traditionally not talked in terms of the people, it's talked in terms of the working class, or it's talked in terms of the proletariat, it's talked in terms of very particular groups, minority groups. And that the problem on the left, therefore, is that it doesn't appeal to the generality. It should be more populist, more discursively inclusive than historically it has ever been. And that sets up the tension between Laclau and other kinds of leftist discourse. Then finally, you get to the Moffat-Tormey interpretation of populism. I don't agree with my own definition. It's not actually mine. This is Ben Moffat, who's now at Monash, was my PhD student. I helped him develop a solution to a puzzle that he was working on in his PhD. And I said, look, let's just do a joint publication. Went out in political studies. But I don't actually agree with it. So I'm setting myself up for more self-contradiction here. But the thesis there is that populism isn't an ideology. It's not a regime. It's not a comparative thing at all. It's a style of politics. So the problem here that Ben and I have rehearsed over the years is that it feels like something that you switch on and switch off then. So if it's a style and it's a bit like putting on a hat or a set of clothes and so on, then what is the substantive claim that populism represents? Are we not just playing with a kind of televisual spectacularization of the political rather than trying to get at the essence of what a particular substantive claim is? So I've always been a little bit sort of unhappy about it. I'm happy to take the kudos for being part of a new innovation. That's what we all aim at as academics, isn't it? That you get known for something. The problem is I'm now known for something that I don't actually really agree with. My own approach, as Isan knows very well, is to think in terms of, therefore, the indeterminacy of populism and to think about it really in relation to what I would call the crisis of representation. So I think under modern conditions, representation, authorization simply is becoming more and more problematic for reasons that go right back. Marx explained this very well. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses the true conditions of his kind. In other words, we are no longer believers in some narrative about why we should obey someone else. So, and if that sounds a little bit, so I'm very conscious of the regional features of this workshop here. Really what Marx is talking about is the modernization process. That as that modernization, capitalism, globalization unfolds, so we become skeptics, pagans, to use the phrase by Lyotard. And in that process, we become skeptics about politics and authority and our ability to influence the world around us. So we've got two choices here, and I'll leave you with this thought because I'm well past my time. You can either go back to a form of fundamentalism, and we see that around the world, particularly in our region, the people faced with this miasma or cliff edge of lack of certainty go back to something certain. And it could be faith, religion, it could be tradition, it could be something. But that search for something to anchor our lives in then reauthorizes, in a fundamentalist way, political authority. Or we become and we are left with anxiety, stress, lack of certainty, things that we try to grapple hold of. And that is, I think, very much part of the modernization story. Lack of trust in politicians, lack of trust in anyone who has an authority claim is very intrinsic to what Lyotard calls the postmodern condition. And that was in 1984, he wrote that book, right? So the puzzle that you guys will have, I think, is how to operationalize the concept of populism, how to make it useful. I think it's a kind of an indeterminate concept, but I think that makes it quite a useful concept for the purposes of comparative research. The fact that it's not settled, the fact that we argue over it, the fact that it has nuance. Is it a global? Is it a Western concept? Is it something which really does have application in Southeast Asia, in other countries in our region, and so on? I think is going to set you up for a fantastic day's events. So conscious, Isan said, maybe you could do half an hour, but we kind of settled on 10 and we've come halfway down the middle. I hope I haven't intruded too much on the rest of your day, but please do enjoy your time together. Wishing you the very best of luck for a very productive workshop. Well done, Isan, again, and welcome everyone to Deakin Downtown. And I shall leave you in peace and enjoy your day. Thank you very much.
Can I get my PowerPoint up there? Yes, that's the correct one. Perfect. Start the slide. That looks good. All right, perfect.
Now I introduce the keynote speaker of the present conference, Dr. Nicholas Morieson, who would also present the concept paper of the workshop titled Bureaucratic Populisms, Institutions as Populist Actors in Comparative Perspective. Dr. Nick.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Omar. And I thought that was such an interesting talk on populism. And I'm very glad that Simon gave it on that sort of conceptual aspect and the problems of populism, because it's something I myself try to avoid in this talk. I rather than put forward my own kind of theory of populism, I thought I might talk more generally about the problems of bureaucratic populism and let everyone else try to analyze those problems through their own approaches to populism, which are also different and varied. So let me also welcome everyone and thank you all for being here, both people here and online. And I feel I should begin by saying, I should preface my talk by saying that there will be people speaking today who have really pioneered this idea of bureaucratic populism and written quite a lot about it. I'm a little bit newer to it, and so I shall give this keynote address in a very humble way and with great humility, and I mean that. Because for me, and perhaps for everyone, this concept of bureaucratic populism is something still being formulated, still being understood, and perhaps we're debating if it exists at all. It's a very interesting topic. Perhaps by the end of the workshop, I will have revised some of my own and our own ideas about bureaucratic populism, and maybe that would be a really good thing. When I'm speaking about bureaucratic populism, and perhaps for all of us, we're speaking about a concept that remains tentative and about which I, at least, am quite uncertain. And I was thinking about the causes of this uncertainty. And I think for me, it comes from this, that when we think of populism, we usually picture charismatic leaders, mass rallies, slogans, and an emotional appeal rather to the will of the people, or at least to the people. Bureaucracy is the opposite of all of this most of the time. It represents procedure, continuity a lot of the time, often hierarchy. Populism, to borrow from Canavan, and we'll talk about this later, is redemptive. It says it will save the people. Bureaucracy doesn't really do that. It's very pragmatic. It's based on expertise. It's quite different. The two appear to belong to entirely different realms, really. But what's interesting is that in many countries, this distinction is becoming less clear. Unelected institutions such as militaries, courts, and state bureaucracies have begun to speak the language of populism, and as we shall see, they have done so for several decades. They'll invoke the people and their will. They'll denounce corrupt elites in government, and they'll claim to act in the name of the popular will. And so this is what we're calling bureaucratic populism. So we, my co-authors of this paper and I, use this term to describe situations in which the state institutions, rather than elected politicians, adopt populist discourse, when they speak as if they were the people's voice and when they present their actions as expressions of public will. This includes situations in which military leaders justify extraordinary interventions in democratic politics, such as coups, as necessary to save the people from a political crisis, from corrupt elites, and so on. So these are not only acts of political manipulation, they are also discursive performances. And here I think I'm sliding into some of Ben Moffat's language here, in the name of conferring legitimacy on institutions. So before developing this idea, let me introduce a basic distinction that underpins this argument. So I'm arguing here that bureaucratic populism has two sides or two faces, if I can put it like that. The first is what we might call exogenous capture, and this occurs when populist leaders reshape state institutions to serve their movements. So I think we'll see a lot of presentations on this because this is very common. We see a lot of this. We've seen this in Hungary with Viktor Orban. We've seen this in Turkey. We've seen this to some degree in India. It's happening right now. In these countries, elected politicians have politicized bureaucracies. They've purged independent officials at times. They've filled public institutions with their own supporters. And as a result, these institutions begin to support the populist project and speak like populists at times. These elected officials understand that control of bureaucracy consolidates their populist political power. So that's one phase. The second phase is what we can call endogenous discourse. And this appears when bureaucracies themselves, independent of perhaps a political party, an elected political party, adopt populist rhetoric without direction from a leader. Judges, generals, or senior officials, for example, may claim to defend the people's interests over corrupt elites in government. We see this happening. They present themselves as guardians of the people's will, saving the people from elected politicians quite often. And this second phase is what I thought we should focus on today in this talk, because it seems to me something a little bit different from the populism we are familiar with, and it's perhaps a little bit less examined. So the idea of bureaucratic populism arises from a paradox. And we might go back to that one. Bureaucratic institutions are meant to be neutral and procedural. Yet they often claim to act as moral protectors of society. At times, they even invoke the people to justify their actions. When this happens, the line between guardianism and populism begins to blur. So what do I mean by guardianism? Guardianism describes unelected actors who see themselves as custodians of the nation, the state, and its founding beliefs, or its official ideology. So guardians believe they must guide or correct the people at times. Populism, by contrast, asserts that the will of the people is sacred and cannot be mediated. When a military or judiciary claims to act as both guardian and representative of the people, these two discourses or logics, they've converged. And it's in this space, I think, that bureaucratic populism operates. So let me illustrate today these ideas with three case studies: Brazil, Pakistan, and Indonesia. And these countries differ widely, but they all show how unelected institutions have used populist language to legitimize power. Now, I don't want to spend too long on the question of how to define populism. I think Simon gave a great talk on it just then, and a wonderfully provocative talk as well. Here on the screen are some of the most widely used today and understood approaches to populism. Rather than offer a definition, I might just say that I think it's worthwhile and actually really valuable to examine bureaucratic populism through the lens of each of these different approaches. I think it will tell us much about the phenomenon and also about the value of these different approaches too. All right, well, I'll move on to the case studies now. So, Brazil, guardianism camouflaged by populist discourse. So what happened in Brazil and why should we call it bureaucratic populism? I think Brazil provides one of the clearest examples of bureaucratic populism. So in 1964, armed forces overthrew the president of Brazil, João Goulart, and called their coup a revolution. The general said they were rescuing the nation from corruption and communism. Pro-revolution, if we can call it that, newspapers at the time described it as the revolution of the people and a work of national salvation. So these are very populist terms. The generals claimed to represent the people's true will, even as they dismantled democracy. In this way, their rhetoric was very populist, but the reality was somewhat more guardianist in the sense that they were trying to defend what they saw as the proper values of the state against communism. What Brazil got was, in fact, military tutelage over a long period, despite all of this populist rhetoric. Now, 20 years later, Brazil returned to civilian rule, but its military's power persisted. In the democratic era of Brazil, the armed forces have continued to see themselves as guardian of order and national integrity. This self-image re-emerged quite recently under Bolsonaro, a former military captain himself, who filled his cabinet with army people, with generals, and frequently invoked the military as saviors of the nation. So again, we hear this populist language linked to the military and coming, in a sense, from military people. Bolsonaro declared that the armed forces of Brazil would guarantee our freedom and were at the service of the will of the Brazilian population. And so, in a sense, this is bureaucratic populism in action. The military had not itself seized power as it did in 1964, but it once again was claiming to embody the people's will through Bolsonaro. This alliance between the military and Bolsonaro worked for some time. However, he was ultimately unable to continue using the armed forces to shield him from his own political problems. And the generals tended to use their own partnership with him to regain influence over the state. And thus we saw in Brazil entire ministries filled with military officers and the military beginning to reassert itself in national life. However, this partnership did in fact break down. Bolsonaro is no longer in office, but once again, there was damage done to Brazil's democratic institutions. So Brazil shows how unelected actors can borrow the language of populism to legitimize first military coups, but ultimately military dictatorship and later military tutelage, and how this problem continues on to this day in Brazil. All right, so let's now look at Pakistan, a country where there's been a lot of populism really from the beginning. So in a curious way, bureaucratic populism in Pakistan takes an almost cyclical form. We see the same thing happening over and over again. Since independence, the military and judiciary have repeatedly portrayed themselves as rescuers of the people from corrupt civilian elites, from elected officials, from governments and prime ministers. And this goes right back to the first coup, which set the pattern. So General Ayub Khan accused politicians of chaos and corruption, and he presented himself as a man of destiny and claimed to restore order for the people's sake. He used a lot of populist language. Now, later on in Pakistan's history, we see similar things unfolding. General Zia al-Haq, when he seized power, promised to purify the state on behalf of the people. And he portrayed himself as a religious reformer, defending devout Pakistanis against westernized politicians. These coups followed a consistent script in which the people were portrayed as pure and elected politicians as corrupt, while the military described itself as the instrument of the people's salvation, as if they were responding to the people's will. Now, in the case of Pakistan, what's interesting is that other state institutions played a role. The judiciary often played a supporting role through the so-called doctrine of necessity, which allowed judges to validate coups as extraordinary but justified, especially in the name of the people. Courts argued that military rule was illegal and yet necessary to preserve the people's welfare. The rhetoric of popular salvation, however, masked authoritarian consolidation over and over again. Interestingly, later on, the judiciary, as we'll hear later, itself became a populist actor, quite apart from the military and civilian leaders in Pakistan. During the lawyers' movement of 2007, the Chief Justice Chowdhury was portrayed, or self-portrayed, in fact, as a hero of the people, defending their will once again against corrupt politicians. Courts began using their powers to disqualify prime ministers and denounce politicians in moralistic language and populist language. Judges claimed to act on behalf of the people of Pakistan, not on behalf of political parties. But they did describe themselves as the last defense for ordinary Pakistanis against these corrupt elites in the parties. So once again, we can see all this continuing bureaucratic populism stemming now from individual judges. It's quite unusual and quite interesting. This you can call judicial populism. And we can describe it as when the courts invoke the people to concentrate power into their own hands. This is blurring the line between democratic accountability and what we might call, in the case of Pakistan, moral guardianship. Over time, this pattern has continued to repeat. The military and judiciary have, in fact, alternated in claiming to embody the people's will and to be saving the people. And so Pakistan's story demonstrates, I think, how bureaucratic populism can become habitual in a nation once established. It appears when institutions of the state begin to seek legitimacy, particularly in moments of crisis. And it endures because it, in a way, flatters unelected authority and gives them that legitimacy that they so desire. So now we'll go to the final case study I have here for you, which is Indonesia, which is, I guess, a more complex case and a more uncertain one in an already uncertain area. Indonesia, I think, presents a different variation. So here in Indonesia, bureaucratic populism became institutionalized under Suharto's New Order regime, where the military enjoyed a so-called dual function, which gave it both defense and socio-political roles. So that's the dual function. The army described itself as the organic representative of the people of Indonesia. Suharto portrayed the military as united with the common people, as the protector of Pancasila, Indonesia's national ideology. So again, here I think we can see that blending, the characteristic blending of guardianism with populist rhetoric. Opposition groups, including Islamists and communists, were branded as enemies of the state ideology and thus enemies of the Indonesian people by Suharto. This language was itself populist, but in practice, the Suharto regime was, of course, authoritarian. The people of Indonesia were praised in speeches and depicted in propaganda, and Suharto pretended to be enacting their will, as did the military, but in reality, of course, people were permitted little or no political agency. Suharto's developmental rhetoric reinforced this paternalism, this guardianship. He called himself the father of development, and the state presented its own economic growth as a gift to the people. Bureaucratic control and surveillance were justified as necessary for harmony and progress in Indonesia. The military, however, was not a temporary guardian, but styled itself as a permanent tutor of the people. In a way, we could see it as substituting itself for the will of the people, as if the people did not quite know what was best for them. It was the custodian of unity, morality, and development. And even after the fall of Suharto in 1998, remnants of this guardianist populist language have persisted in Indonesia. Military figures in Indonesia continued to present themselves as the nation's protectors at times, and civilian leaders have often welcomed their involvement in politics under the banner of national service. These ideas continue to play a role long after the Suharto regime fell. In fact, we see recent governments reviving this logic in part. Under President Joko Widodo, the military played a growing role in infrastructure and security projects. Retired generals were appointed to key civilian posts. The rhetoric remained familiar. All these actions, though they might seem to harm democracy, were done for the good of the nation and according to the will of the people. The people wanted it and the people needed it. And so we see this continuing into this day. So let me reflect now on these case studies and what they might tell us about bureaucratic populism. So across these three cases, I think a pattern does emerge. Bureaucratic populism is perhaps not in itself a subtype of populism. That might not be the best way of looking at it. Perhaps we could see it, depending on your approach to populism, as a repertoire of legitimizing strategies, or we could see it as a discourse. Either way, it is what happens when unelected institutions borrow the vocabulary of populism to justify their own authority. They speak of the people, they condemn elites, and claim to act selflessly for the nation. But in practice, they limit the people's power over and over again. So the result is a kind of inversion. The language of popular sovereignty is used to defend bureaucratic and military control inside bureaucratic populism. So this pattern perhaps has some implications for how we study populism. It suggests that populism really isn't confined to elections or to charismatic leaders, and certainly not to elected officials or people vying to become elected. It is the language of legitimacy that can be spoken from within the state and by state institutions. It also shows how populism's emotional appeal can be appropriated by institutions. When generals or judges rather speak like populists, they transform the vocabulary of populism and even democracy, these two very related concepts, into an instrument of authoritarianism or tutelage, or both. It also reveals how bureaucratic populism also arises in periods of crisis, of disillusionment, when elected governments are seen as corrupt or ineffective, or governance completely breaks down. In such moments, unelected actors claim that only they can rescue the nation. And the cycle repeats itself because the appeal of this moral authority is very, very strong. The appeal of populism is very strong. We can think of bureaucratic populism then as part of a broader trend towards what some scholars have called competitive tutelage. In this arrangement, unelected bodies compete with elected ones for the right to speak for the people. They use the same moral language as populist leaders, but deploy it to protect their own institutions, not to empower the people. Although in their own minds, of course, they are trying to protect the people, if not empower them. The paradox is that institutions designed to constrain power become sources of power themselves. And this is one of those paradoxes of bureaucratic populism. The bureaucracy is there to constrain the power of elected officials, not to take all of that power for themselves. And once again, I think perhaps the final point to make is that bureaucratic populists are always promising salvation in the name of the people, but I think as we look across cases, we'll find that they always deliver constraints. So this brings us back to Margaret Canavan's famous observation that democracy has two faces. One is pragmatic, represented by institutions and procedures and experts. The other is redemptive, animated by the belief that politics can restore virtue, unity, even prosperity. Bureaucratic populism imitates the redemptive face while preserving the pragmatic institutional core. It's curious in that way. There's nothing else quite like it. It borrows the language of renewal and redemption and the people's will, but uses that language to justify hierarchy and control. So the promise of redemption is only ever rhetorical, as far as we can tell. The result is moral authority granted to institutions through their invocation of the people's will without any democratic accountability whatsoever. Recognizing bureaucratic populism, therefore, helps us to see the flexibility of populist discourse. It reminds us that populism is not only a bottom-up movement. It can be a top-down strategy used by state officials. It can come from within the very institutions that are supposed to stand above politics, be neutral. Militaries and courts have, of course, always sought legitimacy, but their increasing use of populist language shows how far the vocabulary of democracy and populism in that respect has travelled. When unelected institutions claim to embody the people, they both echo and in a sense erode the spirit of popular sovereignty. So let's conclude here with a few thoughts. First of all, the concept of bureaucratic populism is still developing. I think it probably shouldn't be treated as a full subtype of populism necessarily, but perhaps something more akin to a set of rhetorical strategies used by bureaucratic actors to gain and maintain power. But what seems clear is that unelected institutions around the world increasingly claim to act in the people's name. There may be militaries in Pakistan or Brazil, courts in Hungary and Indonesia, or other administrative bodies elsewhere. Each uses the language of the people to justify power that is ultimately not derived from the people. And so across these cases, the same paradox tends to occur. The people are invoked but never empowered. They're praised as the moral foundation of the nation, yet their role in shaping this nation is always curtailed. Instead, guardians tend to speak on their behalf, and in doing so, substitute their own judgment for the popular will, even as they claim to be representing the voice of the people. So for scholars of populism, this presents both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge, I think, is conceptual clarity. And here we start to get into rather tricky territory. After all, if we start claiming every appeal to the people is populism, the term does start to lose its meaning. So I think when conceptualizing bureaucratic populism, we should be very careful to distinguish between populist discourse and guardianist behavior on the part of bureaucracies and militaries. So I'd like to close now with I suppose, a simple thought, which is populism has been described as the redemptive face of democracy, the voice that calls the system perhaps back to the people, if not to its ideals. Bureaucratic populism shows that this redemptive language can be imitated by those who do not share in its democratic purpose. Militaries, courts, and bureaucracies can all speak the language of the people, but when they do so, they often claim moral authority rather than democratic accountability. And the result is a politics of salvation that delivers no participation. So I shall end there and merely add now that what I described here is certainly no finished theory, but I hope you'll take it as an invitation, and I hope that the outcome of today's discussion can refine this concept, critique it, or even reject it. Whatever the outcome, I think we should count that as progress. So thank you very much.